The HOA built a pipeline straight through my ranch, and they didn't even ask. One morning, bulldozers showed up and tore my world apart, knocking over the tree I planted for my late wife while my granddaughter watched in tears. The HOA president, Carla, just smirked behind the sheriff she brought, telling me it was for the good of the community. So I came up with a revenge plan to cut off their water supply for good. But what she didn't know was that her entire project was built on a lie, a secret that was about to make me the most powerful person in this entire valley. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments because you won't believe what happens next. And if you believe homeowners deserve to win against a corrupt HOA, hit subscribe because you're going to love how this story ends. The first sign of trouble wasn't a letter or a phone call. It was a flash of high-visibility orange through the cottonwoods down by the creek. I was fixing a loose board on the porch, my granddaughter Elise sketching in her notepad beside me, when I saw it. You get to know the rhythm of your own land, the way the deer move at dusk, the specific call of a hawk circling overhead. Bright orange vests and metal tripods are not part of that rhythm. I put my hammer down and told Elise to stay put. My knees aren't what they used to be, but I made my way down the slope of the pasture pretty quick. It was my land, every one of its 20 acres, and I hadn't called a survey crew. There were 3 of them, pounding stakes into the ground a few dozen yards from the water. The youngest one saw me coming and muttered something to the man with the clipboard. By the time I reached them, they had their defenses up. I kept my voice even. "Morning. Can I help you fellas?" The one with the clipboard, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, wouldn't meet my eye. "Just doing our job, sir." I pointed to the fence line they'd crossed 50 yards back. "Your job is on my property. I didn't hire you." He finally looked at me, sighing like I was the biggest inconvenience of his week. "We're authorized. HOA easement extension." I almost laughed. "I'm not in your HOA, never have been. This ranch was here long before your little gated community was even a blueprint." He just shrugged and pointed his pen back toward the manicured lawns visible over the ridge. "Tell it to them. We've got a work order." They turned back to their equipment, a clear dismissal. They were just hired hands, but standing there on my own grass, being treated like a ghost, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This ranch wasn't just dirt and fences to me. I bought it after I lost my wife, Claire. We'd always talked about getting a piece of land like this, a place where the world couldn't get its hooks in you. After she was gone, it felt like the only thing left to do. It was supposed to be a place to heal. When my daughter and her husband were killed in a car wreck 2 years later, this place became the only home my granddaughter Elise had ever really known. It was our sanctuary. It was where I'd planted an oak tree for Claire, right on the ridge overlooking the creek. We'd sit there sometimes, Elise and I'd tell her stories about her grandma. The land held our memories. It was all we had left of them. So, when a woman named Carla Withers showed up at my gate 3 days after the surveyors, flanked by 2 sheriff's deputies, I knew this wasn't some simple misunderstanding. She was in her 50s, with a posture as stiff as the clipboard she held like a weapon. "Mr. Travis," she announced, not asked. "We're here about the pipeline." One of the deputies, a younger man, had the decency to look uncomfortable. The other just stared straight ahead. Carla did all the talking, waving a sheaf of papers. "The community board has approved the water pipeline. The easement is legally sound. Construction will begin next week." I told her the same thing I told the surveyors. "This is private property. You have no easement here." She gave me a thin, condescending smile. "We found a loophole in the original county filings from the 70s. Our lawyers assure us it's perfectly legal. The pipeline is going in, whether you like it or not." I spent the next few days burning through my savings calling every property lawyer in the county. Most didn't even call back. The one who did met me for coffee took a look at the papers Carla had shoved at me and just shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Travis," he said, sliding the documents back across the table. "She's not wrong. They found a nasty little bit of archaic public utility language that no one's used in 50 years. It's a long shot, but it would cost you a fortune to fight it in court, and you'd probably lose." He looked me in the eye. "They know that. That's why they're doing it this way. Hope is a funny thing. You don't realize how much you're holding onto it until it's gone." I walked out of that coffee shop feeling hollowed out. They had all the power, all the money, and a loophole in the law. I had nothing but the deed to a piece of land they were about to tear in half. The bulldozers arrived at dawn the following Monday. The sound was what woke me, a deep, earth-shaking rumble that was completely alien. I stood on the porch, a cold mug of coffee in my hand, and watched them roll across my pasture. The green grass, still wet with dew, peeled back like a raw wound. Elise came and stood beside me, her small hand gripping mine. She didn't say a word. Her silence was worse than crying. They were methodical, efficient. The blade of the lead bulldozer dropped, and it began its slow, relentless march toward the creek. It was headed straight for the ridge, straight for Claire's Oak. I wanted to scream, to run out there, to stand in front of the machine. But what would that have done? Get me arrested while they kept on digging? So I just stood there, frozen, as the steel blade slammed into the trunk. The tree resisted for a moment. Then, with a splintering crack that I felt in my own bones, it shuddered and fell. My wife's memorial, gone in an instant. My granddaughter let out a small sob and buried her face in my side. I just held her tight, watching the machine grind over the stump and keep moving. A quiet devastation settled over me. They weren't just taking my land, they were taking my past. I led Elise back inside, closed the door on the sound, and felt something inside me shift. The grief didn't go away, but something else rose up to meet it. Something cold and hard and patient. I walked to the front gate and watched the churning mess they were making of my life. If they were going to take what was mine, I'd just have to take something back. My first plan wasn't revenge, it was reason. I figured if I could just talk to these people, face to face, maybe I could make them understand. The HOA held its monthly board meeting in a sterile community clubhouse that smelled of chlorine and air freshener. I wasn't a member, but the meetings were technically open to residents of the county if they registered as guests. So I put on a clean shirt, tucked my property deeds into a folder, and walked into the lion's den. The room was mostly empty, just a few bored-looking homeowners scattered in the chairs. At the front, behind a long folding table, sat Carla Withers and 4 other board members. She was in her element here, tapping her pen on a stack of papers, radiating an aura of self-importance. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and walked to the little podium they had. I kept my voice steady, laying out the facts. I explained that the ranch had been in my family's name, clear of any HOA entanglements for decades. I talked about the well and the spring that fed the creek, how it was a delicate system I used for my livestock, my small vegetable garden, and the fire pond that was essential during the dry season. I tried to make them see the land as something living, not just an obstacle to build on. Carla let me speak for about 2 minutes before she held up her hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "Thank you for your comments, Mr. Travis," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. Then she reached into a briefcase and pulled out a document. A man in a cheap suit sitting next to her stood up and walked it over to me. "We anticipated you might have some lingering concerns," she continued, a smirk playing on her lips. I looked down at the paper he'd handed me. It was a cease and desist order. It legally barred me from interfering with their construction. The man in the suit introduced himself as the HOA's lawyer. "We are well within our rights," he said, his voice as slick as his hair. "But I want to assure you, you'll still have access to the main water feed. As a courtesy. A courtesy. On my own land." He said the word like he was granting me a favor from the king. The room was silent. The other board members just stared at their notes. The lawyer went on, talking about community benefits and rising property values. But I wasn't listening anymore. I just stood there, holding that piece of paper, feeling the heat rise in my face. They hadn't come to listen. They'd come to shut me down. Hope crushed. That was the end of that. I walked out of the clubhouse into the evening air, my hands shaking slightly. A man who'd been sitting in the back of the meeting caught up to me in the parking lot. He was older, maybe my age, with deep lines of worry on his face. "Don't let her get to you," he said in a low voice, glancing back toward the building. "She does this to everyone." He told me his name was Mike. He'd lived here for 20 years. The HOA had fined him $600 last month because his trash cans were visible from the street for 2 hours too long. Another neighbor got a lien put on their house for planting a rose bush that wasn't on the approved list of flora. They were all frustrated, he said, but they were scared. Carla ran the board with an iron fist, using fines and legal threats to keep everyone in line. "That pipeline is her pet project," Mike whispered, looking around again. "Her brother owns the contracting company that got the bid. Funny how that works, isn't it?" He said she was getting kickbacks, using community funds to push through a project that primarily benefited her own family's business. She'd manipulated the contracts, hiding the details in fine print no one ever read. That's when a detail from the papers they had given me clicked in my mind. On the survey map, the route they'd planned seemed inefficient. It cut across the worst part of my pasture, a rocky, difficult patch of ground. Why not follow the flatter, easier path closer to the main road? No one was listening inside, but my engineer's brain was starting to whir. Something was off. Something didn't add up. I thanked Mike and drove home. For the next few days, I watched the trench grow, a deep, muddy scar snaking across my land. It filled with murky water after a brief rain, a grim canal cutting me off from my own memories. Every time I looked at it, the anger and helplessness churned inside me. One afternoon, I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked out past my broken fence, my boots sinking into the soft, excavated dirt piled up beside the trench. I needed to see where it ended. I just started walking, following the path of destruction. The trench ran straight and true for a few hundred yards, then took a sharp, almost 90-degree turn, heading directly toward the oldest part of the spring system. It was a crude and ugly thing, but it was leading me somewhere. The survey map they'd shown me was wrong. It wasn't just inefficient, it was deliberately misleading. It showed the pipeline tapping into the main, creek flow, a source that was, according to their loophole, vaguely covered under public domain. But that's not where the water in this trench was coming from. I could hear it now, a faint but steady gurgle. I followed the sound past the end of their dig site, pushing through some overgrown brush. And there it was, the real source. It wasn't the main creek at all. They had tapped into a smaller secondary spring, the original spring head, the one that fed everything else downstream, a source that was located entirely on my neighbor's land, a forgotten plot upstream that belonged to an old man who had passed away years ago. I stood there, watching the clear, clean water bubbling up from the earth before being diverted into their ugly ditch. They weren't tapping a public utility. They were tapping a private spring, assuming no one would ever know the difference. Their entire grand project, their legal threats, their whole empire of dirt, was built on a foundation of sheer arrogant ignorance. They had no idea where the water truly lived, and as I looked up at that overgrown, forgotten piece of land, I realized something else. It was untouched. It was for sale, and I knew exactly what I had to do. The first phone call I made was to George Lindell. George and I go way back, served in the same engineering course for a few years before he went on to a long career as a hydrologist for the government. He's a man who's more comfortable with topographical maps than with people, but if you want to know where water is, where it's been, and where it's going, there's no one better. He listened quietly on the phone as I explained what I'd found, his only comment a low grunt of interest. He came over the next morning and we walked the fence line, not toward the HOA's muddy trench, but upstream, onto the overgrown property next door. It was a tangle of weeds and fallen branches, the old cottage barely visible through the brush. We followed the sound of the water, and when we found the spring, it was like stepping into a hidden cathedral. A perfect circle of clear water bubbled up from between smooth stones, surrounded by ferns. It was the heart of the entire water system for this valley. George knelt down, dipping his hand in the water. He didn't need any fancy equipment. He looked at the flow, at the angle of the land, at the way the earth was shaped around it. After a few minutes of silent observation, he stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees. "Well, Jack," he said, his voice calm, but with a hard edge to it. "Congratulations, you've found the scene of the crime." He explained it in terms so simple a child could understand. The HOA's maps were technically correct, but deliberately incomplete. They showed their pipeline drawing from the creek on my land, which their legal loophole gave them a flimsy claim to. But the creek itself was just a symptom. This spring was the cause. "They built a straw to drink your milkshake," George said, pointing, "but they stuck it in your neighbor's glass, thinking no one was home." Carla's whole plan was built on arrogance. She assumed I was just some old rancher who wouldn't know the difference. She assumed no one would ever walk a few hundred yards upstream to check her work. Back at my kitchen table, a plan began to form. It was a wild, desperate long shot, but it was all I had. I pulled up the county tax records on my old desktop computer. The upstream property, the one with the true spring, was listed under the name of an Arthur Miller, deceased. The property taxes hadn't been paid in 3 years. It was in foreclosure, set to be sold at an online county auction in 2 weeks. The starting bid was low, just what was owed in back taxes and fees. It was a bargain for 10 acres of land and a dilapidated house, but to me, it was a fortune. It was almost every penny I had left in the world. As I sat there, staring at the screen, I watched the HOA's construction crew from my window. They weren't connecting the final pipes yet. They were just running tests, flushing the system. I'd seen this before in my engineering days. They were rushing, cutting corners to get the water flowing, to prove their project was a success before all the final permits were signed off. Their haste was my window of opportunity. They were building a house on sand, and I was about to buy the beach. The next week was a blur of quiet, frantic activity. I went to the bank and liquidated the savings bonds Claire and I had bought when we were first married. I sold my old restored tractor to a collector in the next town over, the one I'd always planned on teaching Elise to drive. It felt like selling a piece of my own history, but it had to be done. I called my contact at the Veterans Association and started the paperwork to pull from my service savings. Each transaction was a gut punch, another piece of my safety net being cut away. One evening, Elise found me sitting in the dark, the glow of the auction website illuminating my face. She didn't have to ask what I was doing. She's a smart kid. She knew we were in trouble. "Grandpa," she said, her voice small, "are you scared?" I looked at her big worried eyes, and knew I couldn't lie. "Yeah, I am," I admitted. "But I'm more scared of what happens if I do nothing. If I don't stand up for this place now, what am I teaching you?" She just nodded and squeezed my arm. There was one last piece to the puzzle. I called Mike, the neighbor from the HOA meeting. I told him a part of the plan, not all of it, but enough. I asked him to start quietly buying up a few shares in the local water service co-op, the small utility that managed the region's water rights. He didn't hesitate. Finally, the day of the auction came. I sat at my kitchen table, the website countdown timer ticking away the seconds like a bomb. My hands were sweating. I had pooled all my money, every last dollar, into a single account. This was it. One bid, everything I had. If someone else wanted that land, I couldn't fight them. In the final 30 seconds, the bid started jumping. My heart pounded against my ribs. I waited until the counter hit 10 seconds, took a deep breath, and typed in my maximum amount. I clicked the button. The screen flashed, confirming my bid. Then, the timer hit 0. Sold! For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, unable to breathe. Then a slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't about victory, not yet. It was about what came next. I looked out the window at the trench scarring my land, at the pipes that led to the water they thought was theirs. Let's see how they like it when I own the well they built on. Winning the auction was just the first step. The paperwork took a week where I watched Carla's brother's crew start connecting the final sections of their precious pipeline. They were arrogant, working in broad daylight, so sure of their power. They had no idea they were trespassing on land that was now legally mine. The day the deed was officially recorded in my name, I didn't celebrate. I got to work. George came over with his maps and a simple plan. We weren't going to destroy anything. We weren't going to sabotage their pipeline. We were just going to restore the natural order of things. The spring on my new property had originally fed 2 small channels. One trickled down toward the main creek on my ranch. The other, a smaller one, flowed into a natural swale that irrigated the pasture land on the Miller property. Years of neglect had clogged the second channel with leaves and silt. All we had to do was clear it out. It was 2 hours of hard, honest work with shovels and a rake. We dug out the old channel, deepening it slightly, reinforcing the banks with stones we found nearby. It wasn't complicated engineering. It was just giving the water an easier path to follow, and water, like truth, always seeks the path of least resistance. With the new channel clear, George and I stood back. The clear, cold water from the spring bubbled up, and, instead of flowing toward the HOA's intake pipe, it simply turned and followed our newly cleared path. It flowed gently away from their trench, disappearing into the thirsty earth of my new pasture. We had, in effect, turned off the spigot. We walked back to my porch, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat down to wait. It took about 3 hours. Around noon, I saw the first sign, A service truck from the contractor sped down the main road and pulled up to the HOA's clubhouse. 15 minutes later, it tore out of the parking lot and headed toward my fence line. A man got out, stared into the now empty trench, and started shouting into his phone. An hour after that, the real fun began. Phones started ringing all over the gated community. I could imagine the conversations. Lawns turning brown mid-sprinkle, showers sputtering out, toilets refusing to refill. Their brand new, multi-million-dollar water system, the one that was supposed to raise their property values, had run dry. All afternoon, I watched the chaos unfold from a distance. Carla's brother, the contractor, showed up. He and his crew stomped around the dry trench, scratching their heads. Then Carla herself arrived in her pristine luxury sedan, her face a mask of fury. She barked orders, pointed fingers, and jabbed her ever-present clipboard at the bewildered workers. They blamed the engineers. They blamed a faulty pump. They probably blamed the alignment of the planets. They never once thought to look 100 yards upstream. I just sat on my porch, sipping my coffee, enjoying the quietest afternoon I'd had in months. The setting sun was painting the sky orange when her car came fishtailing up my gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust. She slammed the door and marched toward my porch, her face flushed and her eyes wild. "What did you do?" she shrieked, forgoing any pretense of civility. "You have sabotaged public utilities. That is a federal offense. I have the sheriff on his way right now." I didn't get up. I just took another slow sip of my coffee and gestured to the empty chair beside me. She ignored it. "Carla," I said, my voice as calm as I could make it, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I haven't touched your pipeline." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb with me, Travis. Our water just vanished. You tampered with it." I reached inside my screen door and picked up a manila envelope from the table. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it to her. It was a notarized, certified copy of the deed to the Miller property. Her eyes scanned the document, her brain slowly processing the legal description, the parcel number, and, at the bottom, the new owner's name. The color drained from her face. "And this," I said, handing her a second document, "is a copy of the original water rights that go with that land, filed in 1957. She stared at the papers, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. The bluster, the arrogance, the absolute certainty. It all just evaporated. She was left standing there, a powerless woman holding two pieces of paper that had just destroyed her entire world. That's not possible," she stammered. "You can't." "I can," I said, finally standing up. I looked her straight in the eye. "And I did. I didn't tamper with your pipeline, Carla. I just protected my private property. The water you were stealing, it's mine now." She sputtered for a few more seconds before her phone rang. I could hear the tinny, panicked voice of the HOA president on the other end. Her side of the conversation was a mess of half-formed excuses and choked-off accusations. She spun around and got back in her car, slamming the door so hard I thought the glass would shatter, and sped off. Later that evening, Mike called. He said Carla's brother had packed up his equipment and left. He told the HOA board it was a geological issue and that his contract didn't cover acts of God. He was washing his hands of the whole mess, leaving his sister to face the fallout alone. The board was in a full-blown panic. I had them exactly where I wanted them. The next day, I sent a simple typewritten letter to the HOA president. It laid out two options. They could begin the costly multi-year process of drilling for a new water source, or they could lease the water rights from me. My price was 10 times what their original deal with the county was supposed to be. Non-negotiable. 2 days later, I received a formal invitation in the mail. The HOA was holding an emergency board meeting. My attendance was requested. It was clear I wasn't being invited as a guest. I was being summoned to a showdown. This time, the HOA clubhouse wasn't empty. It was packed. Every chair was filled, and people were standing 3 deep along the walls. The air was thick with anger and confusion. These were people with dead lawns, thirsty pets, and weeks of listening to their taps hiss and sputter. They weren't just annoyed, they were furious. I stood in the back with George, watching the show. At the front table, the HOA board looked like they were facing a firing squad. Carla was there, but she wasn't in charge. The president, a flustered-looking man named Henderson, was trying to manage the crowd. Carla was attempting to spin the situation. "As we've stated," she said into the microphone, her voice strained. "We have encountered an unforeseen geological shift in the water table. Our engineers are working around the clock to find a solution." A man in the front row jumped to his feet. "A geological shift? My brother-in-law is a geologist. He says the only thing that's shifted is that you people don't know what you're doing." The room erupted in angry agreement. Henderson banged his gavel weakly, but no one was listening. That was our cue. I gave George a nod, and we started walking down the center aisle. A path cleared for us. Every eye in the room turned to watch me as I walked up to the podium, a thick folder in my hand. I didn't say a word. I just opened the folder, and with a calm, deliberate motion, placed a certified copy of my new deed on the table in front of Henderson. Then came the original water rights documentation, then the official county survey maps, the real ones, showing the true location of the spring, and finally, the auction records showing the date and time of my purchase. The paper trail was undeniable, and it told a very different story than Carla's geological shift. The room fell silent. Henderson stared at the pile of documents as if they were a live snake. Carla's face had gone a chalky white. I leaned into the microphone. "My name is Jack Travis," I said, my voice carrying through the quiet room. "And there has been no geological shift. The problem is much simpler than that. The HOA built a pipeline to a water source they never had the rights to in the first place." I gestured to George, who stepped forward. In plain, simple language, he explained the hydrology of the valley. He used a big map on an easel to show everyone the spring, the creek, and the path the water was supposed to take. He showed them exactly where their pipeline was and exactly where the water was. "To put it simply," George concluded, "you built a pipeline across stolen ground to a well that was never yours to begin with. You have no legal rights to that water." The murmurs in the crowd started again, but this time they weren't aimed at me. They were aimed at the front table. People were turning to each other, whispering, pointing at Carla. The mood in the room had shifted, completely and irrevocably. The truth was out, and it was devastating. Carla saw her power slipping away, and she panicked. She jumped to her feet, knocking her chair over. "This is sabotage," she screamed, her voice cracking. "He did this. He's trying to extort this community." I held up my hand, and the room quieted again. "No," I said, my voice firm. "It's called property rights, something this board seems to have forgotten." And then I delivered the final blow. I pulled out one more set of papers. "And while we're talking about doing things legally," I said, "perhaps the board would like to explain these." I slid copies of the contracts for the pipeline project across the table. They were the ones Mike had helped me get through a public records request. The contracts that showed the project was awarded through a no-bid process to a company, Withers Construction, owned by Carla's brother. The contracts that showed the budget was inflated by almost 40% compared to standard rates. I revealed the fake bids from shell companies her brother had submitted to make it look legitimate. I exposed the entire corrupt scheme, right there, in front of the very people whose money she had been stealing. The room exploded. It was a full-blown mutiny. People were on their feet, shouting, demanding answers. Henderson was completely overwhelmed. Carla just stood there, speechless, as the foundation of her little empire crumbled into dust around her. A woman in the second row, a retired schoolteacher I recognized, stood up and made a motion. I moved for an immediate vote of no confidence in Carla Withers, and for her removal from this board, effective immediately. A dozen voices seconded the motion. Henderson, looking relieved to have something to do, called for the vote. It was a sea of raised hands. Unanimous. "The motion passes," he said, his voice barely a whisper into the microphone. "Carla Withers is hereby removed from the HOA board." Carla stared out at the crowd, her face a mixture of shock and pure hatred. She snatched her purse from the floor, turned, and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her with a bang that echoed in the stunned silence. After a moment, Henderson cleared his throat and looked directly at me. The whole room was looking at me. "Mr. Travis," he said, his voice shaky, "would you consider running for her seat?" I didn't give Henderson an answer right away. Humiliating Carla in a public meeting was one thing. Joining the very organization that had tried to ruin me was another. I spent the next couple of days in a state of uneasy quiet. I started negotiating a temporary water lease with the HOA board, a deal that was fair but firm, putting them on a clear path to finding a legal, long-term solution that didn't involve my land. It felt like the beginning of the end. But people like Carla don't just accept defeat. They don't fade away quietly. When you take away their power, you're left with nothing but pure, unfiltered desperation. And desperate people do stupid things. A few nights after the meeting, a noise woke me from a dead sleep. It was around 2 a.m, a low, grinding sound coming from the direction of my new property, the one with the spring. It sounded like an engine, but it was rough, inconsistent. I got up, pulled on my boots, and grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight I keep by the door. I told Elise to stay inside and lock the door behind me. I didn't take a weapon. The best weapon I had was already in place. After buying the Miller property, the first thing I'd done was install a simple chain-link gate at the access road. The second thing was mounting a small, motion-activated trail cam to a tree overlooking it. It was meant to keep an eye on things, maybe catch some deer on camera for Elise. I never imagined what it would actually capture. As I got closer, the noise grew louder. It was the unmistakable groan of a backhoe, its engine straining under a load. Through the trees, I could see its headlights cutting erratic beams through the darkness near the spring. Someone had cut the lock on my gate. My heart started pounding, not with fear, but with a kind of grim certainty. I didn't rush in. I stayed back in the shadows, my phone in my hand, and called the sheriff's department. I spoke in a low, calm voice, explaining that there was a trespasser on my property, operating heavy machinery, and that they were tampering with the primary water source for the valley. Then I circled around, staying out of sight, and watched. The operator of the backhoe was clumsy, frantic. It was Carla. She was trying to build a crude dam of mud and rock, trying to block the channel George and I had cleared, to force the water back toward her useless pipeline. But she didn't know what she was doing. The bucket of the machine gouged deep into the soft earth, tearing up the delicate ecosystem around the spring. Instead of diverting the water, she was just making a bigger and bigger mess. Suddenly, she hit a section of soft clay. The bank of the channel collapsed. A torrent of water, mud, and debris broke loose, surging downhill not towards her pipeline, but towards the property line of a neighboring farm. It was a minor flood, but it was destructive, washing out a fence and flooding a small equipment shed. I had it all on video. The flashing blue and red lights of the patrol car appeared at the end of the access road, just as Carla managed to get the backhoe stuck in the mud she'd created. I met the deputy at the gate. It was the same younger one who had flanked Carla when she first came to my ranch, Officer Lentz. He looked tired and profoundly annoyed. "Dispatch said something about tampering with a water source?" he asked. I just pointed toward the sound of the sputtering engine. "She's right over there." We walked up to the scene. Carla was climbing down from the cab of the backhoe, covered in mud, her hair a wreck. When she saw me and the deputy, she immediately launched into a performance. "Thank God you're here, officer," she cried, pointing a shaky mud-caked finger at me. "He provoked me. He's trying to ruin everything. I was just trying to fix the water problem he created." Lentz looked from her to the muddy disaster zone to me. He just looked weary. This was no longer a case of paperwork and civic disputes. This was a crazy woman with a backhoe in the middle of the night. His lazy deference to authority had finally hit a wall. I didn't say a word. I just took out my phone, unlocked it, and showed him the video from the trail cam. It showed a clear, time-stamped image of Carla's car arriving. It showed her cutting the lock on my gate with a pair of bolt cutters. And then it showed the last 15 minutes of her inept, destructive rampage with the backhoe. There was no sound, but none was needed. The pictures told the whole story. Lentz watched the entire video without expression. When it was over, he sighed the sigh of a man who knew his night was about to get a lot longer. He looked at Carla. "Ma'am, please put your hands behind your back." Carla's face crumpled. The act, the lies, the bluster, it all fell away. "You can't be serious," she shrieked. "He's the criminal here." "Ma'am," Lentz said, his voice flat and final, "I have you on video committing breaking and entering, trespassing, destruction of private property, and illegal tampering with a waterway. Right now, the criminal here is you." As he clicked the cuffs into place, the local news van I'd called on my way over pulled up behind the patrol car. A reporter and a cameraman came jogging up the path, their camera light flipping on, bathing the whole pathetic scene in the harsh, unforgiving light. Carla, in handcuffs, turned toward the cameras, her face contorted in a mask of rage. He's ruining everything, she screamed at the reporter. I stepped into the edge of the light, close enough for the microphone to pick up my voice. Not everything, I said, my voice steady and clear. Just the part you never earned. 6 months have passed since the night Carla traded her clipboard for a pair of handcuffs. The deep, muddy trench that scarred my pasture is gone now, filled in and seeded over. You can still see a slight depression if you know where to look, a faint reminder of the battle that was fought here, but the grass is growing thick and green again. I planted a new oak sapling on the ridge for Claire, not far from where the old one stood. It's small, just a whip of a tree for now, but it's strong and it's taken root. The ranch is quiet again. It's the kind of deep, peaceful quiet that lets you hear the rustle of leaves in the wind and the gentle murmur of the creek. It's the sound of a place that's finally been allowed to heal. Things have changed in the valley, and not just on my land. I ended up taking Henderson up on his offer. I accepted the seat on the HOA board, but on one condition, that they also appoint George Lindell to advise on all technical matters. They agreed without a second of hesitation. The old board, the one that rubber-stamped Carla's every whim, was dissolved. We held new elections. The new board is made up of me, George, and 2 of the homeowners who had been most vocal at that emergency meeting, including Mike. Our first official act was to draft and pass a new bylaw. It states that any future utility expansion or major infrastructure project requires a 2/3 majority vote from every single homeowner. No more loopholes, no more backroom deals. The power is back where it belongs, with the people who actually live here. We finalized a formal water rights lease with the HOA, a simple, fair agreement that guarantees them a stable water supply at a reasonable price, while legally cementing my ownership and control over the source. The gate to the spring now has a new, heavy-duty lock, and the land around it is designated as a protected nature preserve. We gave it a name. At a small, quiet ceremony with just me, Elise, and George, we put up a small, hand-carved wooden sign. It reads, Claire's Well. The best part of all this isn't the legal victory. It's watching Elise. The fear that had settled in her eyes for months is gone. She spends her afternoons down by the creek again, her sketchbook filled with drawings of dragonflies and the new oak tree. She smiles now, a real, genuine smile that reaches her eyes. The other day, we were walking the fence line, checking for breaks, and she just stopped and looked out over the pasture. "It feels like home again, Grandpa," she said, and she was right. The community, once divided and intimidated, has started to come together. People who used to just nod politely from their cars now stop to talk. Mike came over last weekend with his son, and the 3 of us spent all Saturday putting up new fencing along my northern pasture. The woman who called for the vote against Carla brought over an apple pie last week, said it was the first time she'd felt like baking in years. A wall of fear has come down, and in its place, a real neighborhood is starting to grow. As for Carla, her last desperate act was her final undoing. The criminal charges stuck: trespassing, felony destruction of property, illegal tampering with a waterway. But that was only the beginning. Once the new board took over and opened the books, we discovered the true extent of her fraud. The HOA, representing the very people she used to bully, filed a massive civil lawsuit against her and her brother's now bankrupt construction company for restitution. She had to sell her big house to pay for the lawyers. Her brother moved out of state. Nobody visits her. No one speaks her name. She became a ghost in the community she once ruled with an iron fist. Her reign of petty tyranny is over, not with a bang, but with the slow, crushing weight of consequence. Last night, I stood on my porch, watching the last light of day fade behind the hills. The air was cool and clean. I wasn't just looking at 20 acres of land. I was looking at a promise I'd kept, to my wife's memory, to my granddaughter's future, and to myself. It was never just about a pipeline or a legal document. It was about a line someone tried to draw across my life, and the decision I made to not let them. I didn't just protect my land, I reminded them all who it belonged to.